All right, so let's get started. Welcome. This is week 2, and we are now getting deeper into blockchains. So we started with lecture 1, blockchains at 20,000 feet, trust platforms. Lecture 2, we started blockchains as data structures. So it's a chain of blocks, and the chaining was through cryptographic primitives called hash functions. And lecture 3, last lecture, we looked at the first decentralized aspect of blockchains and how to build a protocol, this notion of a protocol, which participants can follow that is permissionless. That means anyone can participate. At the same time, robust to arbitrary bad behavior. So we got some intuitions towards it, and we looked at something called the Nakamoto protocol. The key for the blockchains to work is the different participants should be able to communicate. And they should be able to communicate in some free way without censoring and without worry that maybe they get linked to some things. And that is, there is an underlying network behind the blockchain. And blockchains are really you can think of it as an application layer over an underlying network. This network itself is the focus of this lecture. We'll revisit it towards the end of these lectures, where there's substantial work in focusing on rebuilding networks and making them more robust, making them more sensitive to upper layer imperatives, application layer imperatives. We'll talk a little bit at the end. We'll revisit it, but largely this is the lecture that we focus on how this underlying network looks like. So what do we want out of this network? Well, we want to make sure that it's accessible to everybody, aka internet. B, you should not have to have a centralized point of entry, www.google.com. If you don't want to have a centralized point of entry to get into the service. So these are two things. You should be able to enter. Anyone should be able to enter. That google.com will let you, right? Pretty much anyone with an internet service. I can't speak for every country, but largely yes. And B, but it's centralized. You need to go to that server, and that's a single point of access against it's anathema to decentralization. So the primitive that we really want is ability to enter and just broadcast. And broadcast, what do you broadcast? Typically, you broadcast transactions, you broadcast blocks. We got a feel for that last lecture. And everyone should be able to hear it. This is the robustness that you want. And the robustness that you really want is that people should be able to come and go. So the network is managed by, I guess, other participants who provide the resources. And the network itself should work. You shouldn't have to depend upon some servers being specifically online and so forth. And it should also allow the network to grow. So it should change. It should be dynamic. And it should still serve its basic primitive. The real primitive, that's all we want, actually. We don't necessarily want sort of point-to-point links. We don't want multicast. We don't want multiple unicasts, just using networking terminology. What we really want is just broadcast. The same information to everyone. That information is blocks. That's what we want to broadcast. So now that we're starting talking about a network, largely there are two classes of network architectures. And the first one has been dominantly the form of architecture today. Which is what is called a client-server architecture. So there's a server, a large computing storage resource with substantial amount of network flow and network bandwidth to it, and all the clients connect to it. And the previous example of google.com is exactly this. Of course, there may not be a single server. It may be mirrored in different geographic places just to provide diversity and robustness to denial of service and so forth. But largely, it's still a server. And I want to contrast this with the original dream of the internet, which is that it's a decentralized network where individuals bring in whatever compute, whatever storage, and whatever networking they can bring. It could be mom's basement with just with a simple like your home kind of connection versus enterprise T1 links and large servers and data centers. And you want to have this heterogeneity and be able to have a network that connects them all. And the internet was actually built exactly for that. And the control and the transport layer and the associated IP layers and the algorithms therein kind of handle traffic for a heterogeneous network. And this was like Web 1, you could call it. Web 2 didn't go that way. Web 2 became largely centralized, where few platforms controlled most of the traffic. And the internet became a client-server architecture. Blockchains are heralding what one may call Web 3. And with that, the networks are, again, there's some renewed interest, let me put it this way, in peer-to-peer networks. But when I talk about networks, one can think of a physical network, like actual machines and actual physical links. Like, I could be connected to EduRoam here, but EduRoam itself is connected, the university itself is connected to a T2 link and so forth, right? Like some maybe fiber connect backends. So this is like a physical network. But what I am talking about when I talk about a network is more an overlay, like a virtual network. So, and think of it as just IP addresses that are kind of masking the underlying how you're connected to the internet, the actual physical mechanisms. So how do you build these overlay networks in a peer-to-peer way? This was sort of a hot or a very active research area in the late 90s to early 2000s, when Web 1, like the internet was born, and there was an interest in peer-to-peer services. I don't know if someone's heard of Napster. Associated networks were trying to being built. The internet didn't go that way. The commerce and the economic pressures were against it. And but the research still remains and still remains relevant. One type of building such an overlay network. So you need to build an overlay network out of physical networks. Physical networks are geographic. Inherently, there's a native geographism to it, especially wireless. You can connect to nearby ones. But overlay networks are not like that. The internet or IP-based networks are just the IP addresses, and it's really very little to do with, or may not have much to do with geography. And sort of one way to build such an overlay network is to be very structured about it. Nodes come in, there is a way in which they connect, and you perhaps have a loop around it, like a ring. So these are the next notions of structured networks. And you want to build these structured networks in a robust way. So a classic one is called CORD, with well-defined sort of routing rules. So what does a network do, right? You need to form links. And also, anytime you want to broadcast, there is a way in which to route packets. You should also be able to identify who is in the network and how to sort of route packets to them, because it's not everybody is connected to everyone. So you have to go on the network and find paths along the way. That was sort of a more structured way, and you have some control over the kind of participants. Blockchains, with its permissionless, at least Bitcoin, you really are thinking of unstructured overlay networks, where nodes really you don't have any requirement on them to stay long enough or be connected. And these are unstructured networks. An example would be just every node makes D connections. So you can think of it like a graph with D links, D edges. There's no identifier to the nodes. You don't need to have an identifier, unlike structured networks, which are much more identifiers. They have a specific identifiers. And an example would be just to have a random graph. Just make D-random connections. And the point of this is that this is an example of an unstructured graph. I'll just make this point, and we'll double down on what are some good properties. It seems pretty basic to form, because I come in as a network. I need to know a few seed nodes, and I just go and make some connections to them. D of them. D could be like, I don't know, 10, 8. I just make some connections, and I'm already connected. And everyone's making some random connections like this. It's possible that someone never gets connected because nobody connected to it. But notice that you will make connections. I'll always try to make connections. So in some connectivity. And what are some properties? We'll see very briefly. Routing is not easy because you don't exactly know. There's no node identifiers. You don't exactly know, what path to take. You may not have notions of the shortest path and things like that. If you have structured networks, right, you can follow the shortest paths, and routing can be more specific. Whereas here, identifiers are not there. They're just connected randomly. And I know who I'm connected to. And of course, they know who they are connected to, but that's about it. So routing is not very, there's no real science. And so potentially may take some time. But what we'll see, and I'll make a point, is that within, if there are n nodes connected, then within sort of order log n, you'll be able to reach anyone in the network, which is about as good as it gets if you have like a tree. Yes.
So yes, to clarify, sorry, it's a deregular graph because each node has an out degree of D.
Notice that the in degree could be different. The out degree is D because I can make connections, but the in degree could be different because it could be more coming in. But I was just giving an example here. We'll try to dig down on exactly a lot of a specific one, like what Bitcoin is doing and what Ethereum is doing. Okay, I didn't get your name. Jude. Do you have a question?
I mean, I don't know like how literally I should take the visual, but connections are one way.
Connections are always two way. You make connections, and making a connection is one way, but once you make a connection, the internet connections are always two way. So it's not like, oh, I talk and the other side listens. It's also the other way around. But they can choose to only treat it as an incoming connection. It's a matter of syntax or semantics, how you want to interpret it. But all I want to say is that I just want to distinguish one way versus two way in the sense that a connection is always two way.
I mean, like, does a connection mean that both of them are announcing to each other? Or can it just be...
That depends on the protocol. And there is some, once you're connected, you can choose both ways. That depends on the protocol. And we'll talk a little bit about push versus pull and so forth. Yeah, that's a minor issue. But the fact is that they're able to talk both parties. That's just how internet connections are built. So how do you, so now, Ori, right? No, Ori. So, I mean, as Ori is asking, like, what is this? How do you spread or how do you send information? Well, you can do what is called gossip, which is like an epidemic spreading, where once a node gets a block, so-called infected, it just sends the block along, relays it along to the ones that it's made outward connections to. So they get infected, so to say. And this information spreads over the network. And good news is that it spreads exponentially. Everyone's default, and there's some, of course, loops, but largely spreading exponentially. And this is the key point of, I've been alluding to this logarithmic fact, but the key point is that regular graphs or deregular graphs are expander graphs. So they're it's well connected, very sparse, because hardly a few connections per node, right? Very large number of nodes, thousands of nodes, but only 8, let's say, or 3. I was giving an example. 2 is no good because there's just a line, but anything more than that is already good. And the key points of major point of graph theory is that if you just have a random deregular graph, even a 3 is an expander. Expander simply means that the end-to-end paths, the diameter of this graph is still very small, this log n. And that's sort of the intuition for building just random graphs. And because this any node is not too far away in terms of hops from any other node. And that's sort of an intuition that the good news is that these are easy to build graphs. And when nodes leave, there's still a random graph. When node comes in, it's easy to add in. It's also just make random connections. So it's kind of natively built. The good news is that it's already well connected. And the Bitcoin network is exactly of this form. Just the numbers are maybe specific. So it makes a TCP connection. So that's the underlying protocol, very accessible, very democratic, largely democratic. You make 8 outbound connections. Node makes explicit 8. Of course, like I pointed out to Ari, the incoming connections need not be 8, right? There's no limit to that. But you do want to limit so that you don't get stressed out or you don't get sort of network attacks on large number of inbound connections. So you limit to some number. I mean, this Bitcoin chooses to put these numbers, but just to give you an idea. So it just puts a limit. And every node that gets into the network maintains a list of other nodes, which is simply IP addresses and their ports, to which I could potentially connect to. And of course, if you're a completely brand and you connect to a subset of these available nodes, where do you keep this set and how do you build this? Well, every now and then the network hygiene would broadcast who everybody is connected to, and they connect to whoever is connected to, and so they build a table of the kinds of participants on the network. You don't have to do this very often, but over time the network sort of knows who else is there, and network hygiene recommends that you change your network. Who the 8 people you're connected to, you change over time. That would be a good network hygiene. It may happen automatically because some people just drop out, in which case you'll have to go and make some other connection. But we'll see a little bit later in this class that there may be other reasons that you want to do this kind of network hygiene. Yes, Aditya. Yes.
We are trying to come up with internet all over again, Bitcoin and using better can be done than this.
I mean, it's there is an effort like this. I mean, Aditya is asking, can we redesign peer-to-peer networks for now that you're Web3? TCP is a good transport layer that can find paths in a heterogeneous network and also manage congestion with the intelligence at the edge. So those issues largely are okay, but you may want to, so that part is there. But having said that, I will say that there is room to redesign networks with blockchain in mind. Let's say Bitcoin in mind and Ethereum in mind, because these are somewhat specific applications and they have specific needs. And we'll talk about a couple of them in this lecture. We'll especially talk about privacy and in this lecture. And we'll revisit, so Ethereum had a large project called Building a libp2p, and it was recently sort of taken on and accepted, and it's a new library, networking library. But it's still built on TCP. But the gossip protocols and the associated network optimizations were specific to blockchains. We'll highlight a few of them. I'll highlight a few of this lecture and some, could be actually good projects. Remember, there's a reading project at the end of this class. I will give a few suggestions on every lecture. Actually will lead to a couple of follow-up projects that you could do, and we'll definitely suggest a couple. Yes. Can I get your name? Hussein, that's right. You mean somebody could censor you? That's right, and they'll send to theirs. Okay, hold on. So we'll talk about this. That's actually my next thing. Yeah, exactly. They'll definitely do everything what you just said. Mining pools will connect to themselves and form high frequency links. There's strong incentive notice to have a good connection to a new block, because as soon as a block is mined, you want to know it, right? Because you want to start mining on the latest block, not on some stale block. And we'll talk about those incentives. So they have strong incentives to be connected to miners. So all the centralization effects that you think do happen. We try to avoid them through protocol methods. Bitcoin allows like 10 minutes, so that's a large sort of time. And we'll talk a little bit about what the effect of that is. So you had a good question. But before that, I wanted to get to what Hussein was asking. Hussein asking a more operational question. This is a bit more abstract and more conceptual. But Hussein is asking more operational. Like, we keep on sending, like that's just going on forever. Like, where do you stop? When do you know to stop? And when do you actually guard it? So in other words, but before that, you need to also know who your peers are, how to discover them. This is a kind of a basic network primitive whenever you have peer-to-peer networks, because I just came in, I want to join the Bitcoin network. So Jackie is not here, but he'll come again at the end of this. He's the president of the Princeton Crypto Club. So I hope you know this. This is a good time to get to know it. And the Crypto Club runs a Ethereum node on campus. They're not running a Bitcoin node, but there's an Ethereum full node. So it's and so you need other nodes need to be connected to it, and you need to go and connect. How do you do this? Well, you need to keep track of some seed nodes which are hard coded. So that way, you know that when you log in, you know some IP addresses you can surely connect to. They're always on. They are like the Bitcoin Foundation runs it. The Ethereum Foundation runs some nodes. These are hard coded, somewhat trusted in the sense that you trust them to be around, but if they're not there, hopefully someone else will be there. You just like a bootstrapping. You just get into the internet, who do you connect to? Because there's no google.com to connect to, right? So you need something. And so some IP addresses are hard coded. They're run by long time Bitcoin maxis. And so this is how you would get started. And that would give you, it's easy to compromise. So you don't trust one seed node. So you need to have enough of them. So that's the starting issue. And you ask, once you connect to them, you ask for their peers and connect. So this is just the connection aspect. But Hussain was asking about the block transmission itself. And we can get into the sort of the weeds, but roughly there are two things, right? Block has two parts. There's the header and the data itself. Notice that the header is plenty enough to know whether you already have it or not, because the header already has all the information about the block in terms of the Merkle root and so forth. So you don't really need to actually download a block. You just need to download the header really and keep all the, notice the chaining is all at the header level. The blocks, the internal data inside the blocks are kind of separate. But of course, nobody can change the data because the Merkle root, the accumulated hash of the data of the block is in the header. So the headers are really have everything. So you should think of the headers are much, much smaller weight than the blocks themselves. And next lecture, we'll look at all these numbers. How big is the header is much smaller than blocks. So you don't want to download the blocks. You really want to download headers. So you can download the blocks first or header first. And there are some optimizations around it. But roughly what you want to do is make sure you have all the headers. And anytime you get a new header, you check if you have it or not. If you think it fits into your chain, in your block tree somewhere, then you can download the block. But the key though, both these methods, is that you only forward your block to your outward links after validating the block. So this is called coupled validity. So that is, and this prevents spam. It's kind of key to, it's amazing that Bitcoin works. Most protocols can work like this, but several do not. And we'll make this distinction. It's kind of a fine distinction. But in Bitcoin, at least, and Ethereum, anyone who receives a block validates it. What does the validation mean? Someone wants to just pitch in? When? Check the proof of work is right. That's good. What else? Yeah, but somebody would have signed it. That's right. But then what else? No, there's something else. Can I get your name? Veronica, welcome. Yeah. Yeah, but that's the identity of the miner, and that has signed. So that's good. Konstantin? Yeah. So what validity I'm alluding to here in this particular slide, and next lecture will sort of nail down all these validity conditions. And in your, of course, assignments, you will know all of the validity conditions. All these things are all correct, by the way. But I wanted to just highlight what Konstantin just said, which is the block is full of transactions. Those transactions make sense semantically with respect to the chain of blocks all the way to Genesis. What are these that make sense? I mean, I just used an English sentence to say semantically makes sense. Example would be that if I spent a coin, then I should have been the owner. And that ownership should have been featured in some blocks or some transactions in the same block or in some transactions in the prior blocks all the way to from the chain to the Genesis. Yes, Konstantin. Great question. So Konstantin is asking, how does this validity happen and what are ways to optimize? It can look kind of, you want to go all the way to Genesis. Gee, I mean, that sounds not good, right? That's like Bitcoin is what, 15 years and you can traverse 15 years of data. I mean, that just sounds a bit weird. That's one of the reasons we are actually doing these assignments, Konstantin, to nail down these kind of nitty-gritties. And one can teach a whole class on this kind of aspects. And I'm trying to do two things here, trying to stay sort of conceptual in the lectures, a little bit above the ground. And in the assignments, you'll go under the ground. But we have an AI assistant, so you'll stay above. Yeah, that's actually the goal of the AI assistant, to not let you get buried too much. Yes, Jude.
If we have a degree of bad actors in chance is impossible?
Yeah, so the network, you need enough good actors. Notice that it's an any trust model. So this is so-called any trust. That means you just should be connected to one good node. If all the people you're connected to decide to lie to you, then this is called a censorship attack. You could just get censored out network-wise. And one of the reasons to do network hygiene is exactly to avoid that. So that way you kind of rotate your list. When censorship is a dangerous thing because they could, all the participants you're connected to, they're all sending the right things until suddenly they don't. And you don't know what is from what. And censorship is a tough thing in networks. Yeah, Ben?
So if there's an adversary, wouldn't it only propagate like past one honest node because then invalidated it? Then that it's a failed validation, like it's an invalid block. It wouldn't propagate past that honest node.
That's spam prevention. So you just need one honest node, and anytime there is an invalid node, it just gets stopped right there. And yeah, so and we'll see that when we do incentives, we haven't talked about any incentives yet. Like, why are people doing this? We haven't talked at all, right? They think of them, they're doing for, like for the greater good or for some public good. But of course, incentives are closely tied to these networks. And we'll get there. Yeah, Aditya.
So suppose I'm it's in my interest to make sure the rest of the network does not really know about blocks that I received from somebody else. Because they are still mining on a single block.
Yeah, you potentially have every incentive to do that. Yeah. So we want to talk about these incentives. Give me another couple of lectures to get there. Turns out the incentives in Bitcoin are just brilliant at it. That it's aligned it's in your interest to also tell other people. In other words, you could hide it to yourself because other people don't know this, right? In fact, the miner who successfully mined a block, you could take the logic that Aditya was asking, right? Why to be a dishonest node? If I am a miner, why tell anybody else I succeeded? Because then they'll all start mining on it. Maybe I should just keep it to myself and mine on that. And this is actually a common thing. It's called selfish mining. So we'll get to this. But there's and it's a plausible, you could say, attack. We'll get into all of this. I think hold on to these thoughts. It's good. Would you? Yeah. So Ju is asking an important question. Just keep sending, spam the network, they're connected, and just keep sending like junk blocks. And every time they have to go do the proof of work and check, gee, this doesn't work. I mean, this is just an issue in general. They don't even have to send blocks. They can just send, I don't know, some traffic of all kinds. And this kind of network resistance you do need. So you do a network coming in here, what would you do, right? You would just call it a spam and just blacklist that node and just kick it out. And whenever it requests a connection, you just boot it out. Of course, that node could have a botnet and try to hide. It's entirely possible because identities are cheap. It's very inexpensive. Any number of IP addresses can be bought as a bot, and you can do this. And there have been some censorship attacks in different networks, but Bitcoin has been largely resistant. Actually entirely resistant to them. The big blockchains, Bitcoin and Ethereum, have been largely resistant. Yes. Mamoru, correct. So Constantine asked a similar question. So this is what is called ledger management. In other words, you want to have a way in which the state or the transactions so far, let's say, are compressed and maintained in an efficient database. It's called a state. And this state should be easily queryable. It should be easily updatable. Both these are important properties. We look at a way of state management in your assignments. It's the one that's used in Bitcoin. It's called UTXO. And it's only a state management. I'll allude to it and I'll give again a somewhat high-level view, a reasonable view next lecture. And the lecture notes, of course, give you all of it. But nothing like actually coding that ledger updates and representations and update it. This is the bulk of your assignment section. That's kind of, it's an extremely important topic. I'm not minimizing that. a good representation of the state so that it's easily queryable and easily updatable is an important component of blockchain management. And when I said blockchains covers all aspects of computer science, this is one of those things I'm alluding to. This notions of state management and have a virtual machine that can compile instructions and update the state is a key part. And the good innovations have happened since Bitcoin's state update. And some of you could do a project on those. It's excellent topics. Bringing multi-threading methods and doing good VM and threading in these state managements is, for those of you who are interested in more deep CS systems and architecture, this is an excellent topic. There's really topics for everyone in every level, from theory and mechanism designs. This is game theory actually live. First time ever in the world where all of the world is involved in a game theoretic setting. And database management, I'll give some assigned projects, such ideas. And definitely you can work on protocols, not to mention economics and cryptocurrencies for sure. So you'll have plenty of opportunities to explore your interests through this. That's why we have this end of the term, we have a small project where you can explore some topics a bit at your own pace and at your depth. So does this make sense? So that's what broadcast is. I just wanted to say that broadcast involves sort of two parts. We've highlighted that last lecture, but I will repeat this. First is the data itself is sent in a raw way. And what is data? Data are transactions. These are like example with Bitcoin, they're just Bitcoin transactions. And they're not put in a block yet. And if they're already in a block, then that's fine. You don't need to keep track of it. But if they are not in any block, then you keep them together as what is called a mempools. And miners constitute blocks or form blocks from transactions taken from the mempool. And once in a while, transactions could be removed from mempool if they never get sort of confirmed. It's been around for too long, nobody's picking them up. So a transaction then is transmitted twice. Once raw over the network, so people can put it in their mill. Second, after a miner puts it in a block and that block is transmitted. So there's like duplication of the data, and you can imagine some form of optimization to do better. And this notion of compact blocks, make sure that you first send the header, so you got that, and then you don't send all the blocks, you query back and forth in an interactive way, and you only download those transactions in the block that you already did not have in your mempool. And this is a good one to also do a sort of a more detailed in-depth study on this kind of a network optimization of block downloads. And these optimizations may get you an edge if you're already a miner. So that way you can keep track of blocks in an effective way, just making the best out of your network. At the end of all of this, right, if I want to abstract what the network gives, I want to prevent censorship. That's a bare bone requirement. That means any packet that is transmitted over the network reaches everybody. That's a core requirement. But then it could reach really, really slowly. So that has to do with delay. And second, how many packets can you receive per second? And this is the so-called throughput or the capacity of the network. So these are two parameters. I just simplified the entire network into just two numbers. C is the capacity at the rate at which blocks can be processed by the network. Bitcoin is very slow, 1 block per 10 minutes. So it's clearly not stressing the network in any capacity way. And D is the delay the block takes from end to end. And Bitcoin blocks are so rare that network is, again, not getting stressed. But in general, a network you can think of as having, if I want to just abstract out the network and when I do different protocol designs or ask why Bitcoin make those choices and why would someone else pick some other choices, I'm going to use these two numbers. C for the capacity of the network and D for the delay. I mean, the fastest the delay can be is, of course, speed of light, right? That's just propagation delay. But then in general, there is queuing delay, and then there is also processing delay. Just compute, because you'll have to serialize, deserialize, connect to the port, send it. This is just nitty-gritty networking. There's processing delay. And the delay, notice, increases with block size. It doesn't get you free. And that's the one point I want to make here. is that why not just have large block sizes? And that's a cheap way to make throughput. And I just wanted to point out that you pay a price in delay. Because the larger the block, the longer it takes to process it. And that shows up in the end-to-end delay. And so block size also shows up somewhere here. The most basic way in which it shows up is block size normalized by the capacity adds to the delay. So the delay, the end-to-end latency depends upon propagation delay, which is roughly speed of light, along with some number of hops, and processing delay, which depends on the block size, normalized by capacity, and queuing delay if there's just a lot of packets coming in. Question? Yes. Yeah, so queuing delay comes when so where does queuing delay come from capacity? It depends upon how packets are coming in and how it's relevant to C. And largely you want to be dominated by propagation delays. That would be the best. And you want to pick parameters so that queuing delays and processing delays are not the cutting bottleneck. So where does delay affect? And what does the delay do to protocols? And let's look at it in the context of the Bitcoin protocol we saw. First thing is that delays means not everybody has access to the latest block. Some people or some miners just have stale blocks because they haven't received it. Network is slow, it's late. It's slow as in there's a lot of delay before new packets are being received. If so, because packets are just blocks. So you're mining on stale things, kind of wasted hash power. You're hashing on something, trying to mine, that it's never going to get used because there's already a latest block. So that's not good. So you want to utilize the hash power, and this sort of makes things incentive compatible. That is from an incentive compatibility point of view. From a security point of view or a Byzantine resistance aspect, forking is a very, very real problem when you have delays. Because people are mining parallel on the same block, and not everybody has received the latest block, 2 blocks can be mined on 1 block, and they show up and forks happen. So delay naturally leads to forking. So let me summarize. And so you would like to minimize delay precisely to avoid both these aspects. So the better the network in terms of delay, smaller the delay, just more efficient it is. So efficiency, and you want to think of sort of current peer-to-peer networks, we want to improve efficiency because now everybody is transmitting to everybody and there's default, right? So it's n times d blocks get transmitted over the air. So right, for 1 packet, 1 block now has n times d. So that's the number in which everybody receives, and it's like d times. There's a second aspect which we haven't alluded to, which is privacy. And we'll spend sort of the second part of this lecture talking about it. If you're not careful with your network, then so far your identity is just your public key. But a public key is really, it's just a string of, it's a hexadecimal string, and what are you going to do with it? No one can identify you. But networks are a lot more identifiable. Just the way cookies and the way internet has developed, knowing an IP address is tantamount to knowing who you are. Largely, advertisers identify you through you. That's exactly what cookies are for. And today, hiding your IP addresses are basic network hygiene. And if someone can connect your IP address with your public key, then your crypto identity got de-anonymized. So we'll talk a little bit about this lecture. And finally, I said that there are some security implications of the network. A weak network leads to an insecure protocol. Things can get forked. So what I'll do is that I'll just go through this efficiency just a bit, and then we take our usual couple of minute break. And then the second part, I'll talk about the privacy and how to sort of build networks so that you don't leak information. The first thing is we did this random peer-to-peer graph, but if you really want to speed it up, you want to do random, but relative to the geography of the links. Right now, randomness is on IP addresses, and for all I know, I could be connecting to Australia. And that's like a long, from a network perspective, a long link away. So really what you need is a geometric random graph. Geometric refers to being respectful of the underlying geography, and that's what geometry is. IP addresses don't necessarily reveal location, especially behind VPNs. Then you want a self-adapting network topology that adapts and learns who is close by and yet be robust, that you can do faster propagations this way. Whoever, if I'm connected to, if they're relatively close by, then you just have a better network. And so you want to build, and there have been efforts to build such networks. So these are random peer-to-peer networks that are respectful of the geometry. And the way you would do it is intuitively, you will explore the network, see which ones have faster connection to, and favor them. But at the same time, you also want to explore some new things. Maybe somebody is even closer. So you want to balance, explore, and exploit. And these are sort of classical algorithms that from machine learning one can bring here and build a network that adapts. This was one such network. So you want to keep a score for subsets of neighbors based on how they relay blocks. And I alluded to Napster, right? And that was using, and BitTorrent came at the same time. Some of you may have heard of it. It was the original peer-to-peer sharing, file sharing network. And they had incentive mechanisms there as well, where I'll be connected to people who, and I'll give them new blocks if they give me new blocks. So there is some native alignment, and nodes get connected if they're being good with each other. So you may want to do that here too. And you want to keep scores for who is being good to you. Goodness can come in, of course, freshness of data. Because if I get a block that I had not seen, then I say, okay, I want to be connected to you because I'm learning something new from you. Or someone could be very fast connected to you, right? That's definitely you want fast connections. But if it's stale, then that's not so helpful. So you want to balance that. And you keep some kind of a score and connect to things with better scores, and also update the scores regularly and making sure that you're not losing out on exploring. Yes, Jude.
Yeah. We kind of stop this, the different kind of an issue where like different kind of geographic partitioning where like every main candidate but like block
Yeah, I mean, that would be a network partition. So Ju is alluding to network partition. So it's possible sort of networks get partitioned and some blocks just live on one side, some other lives. And that's more or less how hard forks form, because they just completely get separated. You really want to avoid such things. But we're already past that. We're now being more efficient. The real way, and what the internet happened, right? The way we went from BitTorrent to Web 2 and content delivery networks is through trusted networks offered by companies like Akamai, which are caching companies, the content delivery. They manage all the underlying networks for all the flow that you want. And there have been some efforts like this to build for blockchains. Largely, I would say not as successful. Primarily because perhaps the traffic on Web3 is much smaller than the traffic on, nobody is streaming movies on blockchains, right? So it's so you've never needed these kind of Akamai style content delivery networks, but one can bring fast relay networks, hub and spoke models, cut through routing, basically cutting edge networking technology from data centers and content delivery networks to Web3. There are some trust aspects now, because you trust underlying intermediaries to do not censor. And one can they can regularly get audited, network audits. They provide some proofs. Again, I'll give some reading and projects that one can read into it. I haven't seen them successful yet, but when Web3 takes off, they have a role and place in the right place. Okay, so largely what we talked about, let me summarize. We looked at how the underlying network supports communication of participants in blockchains. They should be decentralized. So no need to connect to a specific server. Anybody should be able to join. Most importantly, anything I send should reach everybody within some reasonable time. And what we looked at was trying to reduce that time and make sure yet be robust. In the second part, I want to allude to some other aspect, which is the network inadvertently can leak your identity as your public key identity. And how this could be done, what kind of methods, network attacks lead to such de-anonymization, and how one can sort of provide some basic resistance is sort of the second part of this lecture. Let's take a very short break and we'll resume. All right, can we get back? Okay, I do want to cover in the last 10 minutes and then of the second part, which is the network can leak privacy. So how can users be de-anonymized? Well, all you know about a user is their wallet is just the IP address. So how do you link it to anyone else? Well, the old-fashioned way, people can go and whenever they make a Bitcoin transaction, they'll go on Twitter or some social media and make some announcements, and can't prevent blabbermouths. And next thing you know, that social media got linked to your personal physical identity, and because you made these things, you can start linking. In other words, there are other networks other than the Bitcoin network, and let's say social media networks. And if you start connecting them, then of course you can make these connections. And there's an entire company called Chainalysis doing huge amounts of business, dying to de-anonymize transactions based on such interactions. And having, of course, wallets on major exchanges is also a sure way of helping this de-anonymization. Sorry? Which one? Chainalysis especially contracts to governments. So I would say they're extra legal. In fact, the primary customers of Chainalysis are government agencies. Primarily, state actors are their customers all over the world, for sure. So I don't know if you saw WannaCry hack a couple of years ago. WannaCry was a hack that took over your computer and you had to pay in Bitcoin. And Chainalysis was behind sort of cracking those actors and tracking those coins as they move along. Notice that the network is fully visible, unlike like your credit statements. Okay, so I do want to say one thing, is that the Bitcoin ledger, all transactions are public. Maybe what is hidden is who is the IP address, who is the public key, and public keys can be sibylled, so one can have any number of public keys. But the fact is, which wallet, based on identified by its public key, has how much Bitcoin, and where it received from is known all the way from Genesis. So Nakamoto's wallets are fully known, and they've never been used, actually. So they've never been touched since Nakamoto stopped mining a decade ago. So everyone's wallets are public like this. This is kind of an unusual information and active. This is unlike the stock market. Stock market also, you can perhaps have a ledger of who is owning what stock. Not only is that not known, but also not the identities are not known, but also just this fact of who has what percentages are not known. In fact, that's completely a carefully kept secret. In blockchain, is unlike that. You can make out who are the whales. Whales means like a large wallet balances and shrimps. And you can track, whale and shrimp migrations on the network over time. It's entirely fully visible. And Chainalysis looks at this kind of migrations and connects it with, I'm sure, other things, definitely connected with social media posts and things like this. So it's totally a service for. So all I'm trying to say is that Bitcoin net is not as, there is this, what shall I say, public perception that Bitcoin is anonymous. And I just want to point out that the network itself and all the transactions are raw, and everybody is fully private to it, unlike even fiat networks. But that is on the chain itself, at the wallet level. But one can go one level deeper, and the network itself reveals and leaks information. That is, network identities can get linked to blockchain identities, which is the public key. So how does that happen? So this is also this is a very powerful way of de-anonymizing someone. And so how does this happen? So let's take a look. So how do you attack on the net? This is like a privacy attack or an de-anonymization attack on the network layer. So how does that work? Well, first you have a botnet, a bot army, network army that just connects. You don't follow protocol. That means protocol says you connect to D people, like D equal to 8 in Bitcoin, right? And you limit to 117. Here, don't do that. Now, who's going to, anyway, how do you know? It's just a botnet. Nobody's policing you. You just go and connect. You basically, if there are 1,000 nodes, you also have 1,000 nodes yourself, completely sibylling it. Sibylling on the network is very cheap. And this is a few $100 type of attack that we did a few years ago. and where this is like an eavesdropper network. Of course, this is a botnet, so all the networks with nodes within this botnet are all the same node, really. They're just pretending to have different IP addresses, and they're the same node. So they're super connected, extreme connectivity to all the nodes. What does that do to you? Well, anytime a transaction is first broadcast on the network, notice that the eavesdropper will hear it pretty quickly, one way or another, before the rest of the network hears. In fact, if the eavesdropper is super connected, then the very first node that sends me the packet is very likely to be the source of that transaction. And so the eavesdropper has an edge on listening to the network, which means it can try to figure out who was the source of the network. So if I thought, I gave an example or an analogy to epidemics. So this is like finding the eavesdropper has a pretty good shot at finding what one calls in epidemic patient zero, the source of the epidemic. And so this is what can go wrong. And the eavesdropper has access to timestamps from different nodes when it received the packet. It can receive multiple copies of packet because it's connected to so many nodes. It will receive it. And this will not follow protocol. Normally, if I already have a block and someone is trying to send me, I'll say, no, I already have it. But this one is not going to do that. It'll just take from everyone and pretend as if this is the first time I'm hearing it. And then all I'm doing is just timestamp analysis. And a good strategy is just to say that the one I got the timestamp from is perhaps already the source of the network. And I know the IP address, so perhaps, and I know the transaction that I received. Notice that this is not at the block level. This is at the transaction level. So I'm receiving transactions and the raw, and I can maybe trace which IP address in this network sent it. And that allows me to do this. And you can think of two types of adversaries. One is like what fraction of nodes are compromised, right? And the Stasi was supposed to have compromised 16 or 17%. 1 in 6 people in East Germany were working for the state, working for the Stasi. So they were eavesdropping on the network, population at large. And so something like P could be 1 in 6. And you also ask, how many connections do I make? Notice that I don't need to make just one connection to one node. I can make like a lot of connections to one node. It's just network connections. So I can easily do that. And so one can, based on the type of adversary model, one can have two types. One is either I can have sort of a botnet, which is just a fraction of nodes, or I can have this eavesdropper, which is connected, with having multiple connections. And basically the issue is that it's a bad problem. And Bitcoin kind of adapted itself. Bitcoin previously to 2015 had this protocol. It's always connected to 8 people, right? But do I send to all 8 at the same time? That's called flooding. Or you do it what they used to call trickle. Trickle means you have an ordering and you send it in some ordered fashion. You have 8 connections. I'm putting 4 here, but you have 8 connections. You have some ordering and you send one at a time with some fixed time delays between them. And why was this protocol picked? Sort of unclear. And then around 2015, they moved to diffusion. Diffusion means you don't have this specific ordering. On each edge, you put a clock. As soon as the clock rings, the alarm rings, you send the packet there. And they're all done in some independent way. So these are exponential clocks. Yes, Ben.
If the node is keeping a reputation of like the neighbor nodes, and you're always constantly exploiting and exploring, can't you like you say, can't you blacklist the neighbors and those?
Yeah, so Ben is pointing out that network hygiene can sort of help disentangle, but a botnet is still connected to everyone. It's true that it got kicked out, but it has so many connections, it'll try again. Good point. I mean, that's actually more or less how we want to build anonymity. So Ben is saying that you want to do some network hygiene. And we just want to do it in a principled way. And I'll talk about a set of principles in this talk. And turns out, I mean, this is not clear why diffusion and why trickle. And turns out trickle was bad for a specific type of attack, which localized patient zero. And the diffusion was robust against it. But diffusion is vulnerable to other types of, you could say, machine learning. Basically, your eavesdropper has all these timestamps. And it also knows, perhaps knows the network topology. And then you have to figure out what's the most likely node that could have started this, this transaction. And diffusion is not much better, turns out. It just needed a different attack. And these are all links that you can read more in your lecture notes. But you do want some way to prevent against such attacks, because no one then worried about broadcasting their transactions. If I am ever make a transaction, it's like the whole world seeing it. Of course, if I make a transaction, the merchant knows that I made a transaction in regular world, right? And if you're using a credit card network like MasterCard or Visa card, of course, the network knows, and the credit issuing company or the debit bank knows it, but no one else knows it. Here, it's like the whole world seeing it on the network because it's raw on the network. So it's really bad in this way. Yes, Niyusha. If you're fully connected to everybody, there's nothing you can do about it. If the eavesdropper is just connected to everyone, diffusion is still a little bit better there because it receives at a random time, right? This diffusion, what it does is on each of these edges, it puts an clock, and only when the clock rings, I'll send you the packet. And the time the clock rings is random. So even if you're connected, there's some chance that it gets delayed. And you have to account for the fact that somebody else may have gotten and they may have sent it to you already. So in other words, a 2-hop path could also have a chance of sending it to you over a 1-hop path. Whereas in flooding or trickle style protocols, that doesn't happen because it's very deterministic. Even if it's connected, I would say it's a bit like this. And yeah, that's what actually happened. So another attack, maybe more sophisticated machine learning, will de-anonymize diffusion about the same as trickle. That's a work, something I was involved in. But the key was to sort of also help redesign, and I'll get to the key idea. So the key idea, though, is more or less what Wen is saying, which is I'll look at what are we looking for. What are some key ideas we want? First, we don't want symmetry in the graph. So one of the things with diffusion was that, and you asked, like, how does diffusion be any better? Well, diffusion provides, because of this randomness, you would think that there is some anonymity. But the randomness also, because it's very symmetric, right? If you throw a pebble and it goes in circles, then there's still, there's very symmetric and deterministic. But randomness also potentially has symmetry, and you can do things like law of large numbers to get to de-randomize at the heart of it, and that's how you do it. Except the randomization here is the law of large number type of equivalent here is on graphs, and that's what I meant by somewhat more sophisticated machine learning. So you want some asymmetry. You don't want asymmetric graph structures. You also want to make sure that there is mixing. That means an eavesdropper can receive the same packet from multiple paths. If there's only one path I can get it, then I know that the source must have been along that path. So I need to have some mixing. If I just a line is a bad idea. So what's the design landscape? Well, we control the spreading protocol. You can do diffusion, trickle, flooding, random, things like that. You can control the topology of the network. I said you can do deregular, but you can change it, you can do it differently. You can also change the graph over time. So that's like dynamicity. Right now, the spreading protocol would be diffusion. Topology is sort of approximately regular and mostly static. It's not changing very often. So that's when what leads to de-anonymization. And there's a protocol, this is one of a few ideas, which is sort of which tries to bring these principles to provide network level anonymity. The idea is that you want to be asymmetric in the initial path. So that means this is the anonymity phase. You form a path. Along the path, you don't know, nobody can judge because anybody could, on that one line, could be a node, could be the source. And because you have it's along the line. I don't know where you don't know the starting point. The eavesdropper hasn't received it yet, unless the eavesdropper is along the line itself, in which case all behind it you have hiding. And once you hit some point at random, it's like a clock that ticks, and then you spread to everybody. So it's like dandelion because it's got this stem, and then it spreads. And the topology is an anon. So the network has, I guess, two parts. One, you form a random line. At some point, the clock ticks, and then you start spreading. You can use diffusion at that point. Everybody listens to everyone. And you want to change not the deregular graph, but the line graph you want to change regularly, so that that's not learned over time. And so dandelion is sort of one thing that's sort of good properties. It has good mixing properties, and at the same time, it's well connected. And one should make a distinction. One can use other network-wide properties, network-wide hiding, like Tor, like the onion router, which are heavy-handed approaches. And it's probably good for small number of transactions, but not for hiding the entire network. So you need more nodes servicing networks. Those of you have sort of seen, I don't know if Tor is perhaps known here. Yeah, I mean, it's a load on the network. And really, the bottom line is that Bitcoin's P2P network has poor anonymity, despite what one may think of what hackers may think of Bitcoin being anonymous. And Dandelion is sort of a lightweight privacy solution for some class of adversaries. It's a good time here. We'll take a